The crystal chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel didn't stop the room from plunging into absolute, breathless silence. The most feared man in New York's underworld didn't reach for the supermodels or the desperate socialites vying for his attention. Instead, his heavily tattooed hands gripped the waist of the plus-size event coordinator, pulling her directly onto his lap in the middle of the high society gala. The music abruptly halted. Glasses hovered in mid-air. And in that frozen second, everything changed. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of glittering diamonds, tailored tuxedos, and suffocating entitlement. Clara Hughes stood near the service entrance, her earpiece buzzing with the frantic chatter of the catering staff. At 28, Clara was a senior event coordinator for Premier Luxe events, a job that required her to be simultaneously everywhere and completely invisible. She adjusted the dark, tailored blazer over her size 20 frame, shifting her weight in her practical black flats. She knew exactly how she looked in this room, like part of the furniture. To the billionaires, politicians, and socialites sipping vintage Dom Perignon, Clara's fat body was a boundary line, a marker of the working class that they simply looked through as if she were made of glass. "Clara, we have a situation at table 4, her assistant, Chloe, whispered urgently through the earpiece. "Senator Montgomery is complaining about the temperature of the beluga caviar." Clara sighed, her fingers pinching the bridge of her nose. "I'll handle it. Make sure the baccarat crystal flutes are polished for the midnight toast. No smudges." She navigated the crowded floor with practiced grace, a skill she had honed over years of moving a larger body through spaces designed for the painfully thin. She slipped between the silk-draped tables, her movements fluid and silent. She didn't mind the invisibility. In fact, it was her armor. In a world obsessed with hollow perfection, her solid, curvy reality kept her grounded. But tonight, the atmosphere in the ballroom was different. It wasn't just the usual arrogant hum of old money. There was a jagged edge of nervous energy cutting through the classical string quartet's performance. The heavy gilded double doors at the far end of the room swung open, and the temperature in the ballroom seemed to plummet. Clara froze. A silver tray of caviar accoutrements balanced expertly on her fingertips. Gabriel Costa had arrived. He didn't walk into a room. He consumed it. Gabriel was the undisputed head of the Costa Syndicate, a man whose legitimate real estate empire was nothing but a glittering shell over a foundation of extortion, violence, and ruthless control. He was flanked by 4 men who looked like they wore tailored Brioni suits just to hide their concealed weapons. Gabriel himself was striking in a terrifying way. Tall, broad-shouldered, and radiating an almost predatory stillness, he wore a custom charcoal suit that clung perfectly to his muscular frame. His dark hair was swept back, and his jawline looked sharp enough to cut glass. But it was his eyes that made people look away, cold, calculating, and entirely dead to the glittering wealth around him. The string quartet stumbled over a few notes before hastily correcting themselves. The murmurs in the room dropped an octave. Gabriel Costa was not old money. He was dangerous money, and the socialites who usually turned up their noses at anyone without a pedigree were suddenly desperate to catch his eye, paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable power he wielded. Clara watched him bypass the receiving line entirely, heading straight for the VIP alcove at the edge of the ballroom. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and continued toward the senator's table. "Excuse me." The sharp, nasal voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade. Clara stopped, pulling the silver tray closer to her chest. Standing in her path was Sienna Lockwood, a rail-thin heiress pouring out of a barely-there emerald slip dress. Sienna's eyes raked up and down Clara's full figure, a sneer twisting her perfectly injected lips. "You're blocking the thoroughfare," Sienna said loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. "Some of us are actually trying to mingle, not take up the entire aisle." Clara felt the familiar hot prickle of humiliation at the back of her neck, but her face remained a mask of polite professionalism. It was a microaggression she dealt with constantly, the implication that her fatness was an intentional inconvenience to the thin and wealthy. "My apologies, Miss Lockwood," Clara said evenly, stepping back and pressing herself against a marble pillar to give the heiress an absurd amount of space. Sienna scoffed, her gaze flickering to Clara's waist before rolling her eyes. Honestly, they should enforce a dress size limit for the help. It's claustrophobic. She flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder and sauntered away, her target clearly the VIP alcove where Gabriel Costa had just seated himself. Clara took a deep breath, forcing the stinging tears back down. She wasn't going to let a spoiled brat ruin a flawless event. She delivered the caviar, smoothed over the senator's complaints with a practiced smile, and retreated to the shadows near the bar. But her eyes, almost against her will, tracked Sienna's path across the room. Sienna was leaning heavily against the velvet rope of the VIP section, laughing too loudly at something one of Gabriel's associates had said, though Gabriel himself wasn't even looking at her. He was staring at his phone, his expression bored and dangerous. Clara felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver run down her spine. Gabriel Costa was a predator, and Sienna was dancing directly in his crosshairs. By 11 o'clock, the gala was operating at a fever pitch. The champagne was flowing. The music had transitioned from classical to a pulsing, low-tempo beat, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and alcohol. Clara was exhausted. Her feet throbbed, and the corset-like structure of her blazer was beginning to restrict her breathing. "Clara," Chloe's voice cracked over the earpiece, sounding panicked. "The VIP booth, Costa's table. They requested a specific bottle of the 96 Macallan, and none of the servers want to go near them. They're terrified." Clara closed her eyes for a brief second. "I'm on my way. Get the bottle from the manager's reserve." Moments later, Clara was carrying a heavy crystal tray bearing the amber bottle of scotch and 4 heavy-bottomed glasses. She approached the velvet-roped alcove with deliberate, measured steps. The 4 bodyguards parted silently, their eyes scanning her quickly before dismissing her as non-threatening. Gabriel Costa was leaning back into the tufted leather of the booth, one arm draped over the backrest. Up close, the aura of violence surrounding him was palpable. The scent of his cologne, Tom Ford Oud Wood, mixed with a faint, sharp metallic tang that Clara didn't want to think too deeply about, filled her senses. Sitting uninvited on the edge of the booth's adjacent armchair was Sienna Lockwood. She had practically wedged herself into Gabriel's personal space, though he was giving her less attention than he gave the ice bucket on the table. Clara stepped forward, keeping her eyes respectfully lowered. "The 96 Macallan, as requested," she murmured, leaning over slightly to set the heavy tray on the mahogany table. Sienna, visibly frustrated by Gabriel's icy indifference, turned her venom toward the easiest target. As Clara shifted her weight to place the glasses down, Sienna casually extended her stiletto-clad foot directly into Clara's path. It was a deliberate, vicious move. Clara's practical flat caught the sharp heel. With a gasp, her ankle twisted violently. The heavy crystal tray slipped from her grasp, crashing onto the mahogany table. Glasses shattered, amber liquid splashed across the polished wood, and Clara felt her center of gravity vanish. She was falling forward, bracing herself for the humiliating impact of hitting the floor, knowing her large body would make a terrible sound, knowing the whole room would turn and laugh. But the impact never came. Before Clara could register what was happening, a large, incredibly strong hand shot out. Long fingers wrapped around her waist with crushing, possessive force. Gabriel Costa didn't just catch her. With a fluid, terrifyingly powerful motion, he used the momentum of her fall to pull her directly toward him. Clara gasped as she collided with a wall of solid muscle. The air was knocked from her lungs as she landed squarely on Gabriel's lap. His left arm banded around her waist like a steel vice, locking her against his chest, while his right hand settled firmly on her thick, curved thigh to stabilize her. The shattering of the glass was the last sound in the room. The music didn't stop, but it felt as though the entire grand ballroom had been submerged in ice water. Conversations died mid-sentence. Politicians froze with cigars halfway to their mouths. Sienna Lockwood's jaw unhinged, all the color draining from her face as she stared at the unbelievable scene. Gabriel Costa, the untouchable, merciless king of the city, had a plus-size catering coordinator sitting on his lap, and his hands were gripping her as if she were the most valuable thing in the room. Clara's heart was hammering so hard, she was sure Gabriel could feel it against his chest. She was paralyzed, intensely aware of the heat of his body beneath her, the hard line of his thighs, and the shocking intimacy of his grip. She expected to be shoved away, disgusted. She expected him to shout. Instead, Gabriel didn't look at the mess on the table. He didn't look at the terrified crowd. He slowly tilted his head down, his dark, heavy-lidded eyes locking entirely on Clara's panicked face. "Are you hurt?" His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated right through her spine. It wasn't a question asked out of polite concern. It was a demand for a status report. No," Clara stammered, her hands trembling as they hovered awkwardly over the lapels of his ruined Tom Ford suit, unsure where to place them. "I am so sorry." "Sir, You didn't fall," Gabriel interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper meant only for her. His thumb brushed slowly, deliberately, against the fabric of her skirt over her thigh. It was a grounding touch, sending a shock wave of heat straight to her core. "You were tripped." He slowly lifted his gaze from Clara, turning his dead, freezing eyes toward Sienna. Sienna was shaking visibly. "Gabriel, Mr. Costa, She's so clumsy, these oversized girls. They never watch where they are going." "Quiet." Gabriel didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The single word cracked through the silence like a gunshot. Sienna snapped her mouth shut, looking as though she might actually faint. Gabriel's arm tightened around Clara's waist, keeping her firmly anchored to his lap when she made a small, frantic movement to stand up. "Stay exactly where you are," he murmured to Clara, before addressing the heiress again. "I saw your foot, Sienna," Gabriel said, his tone conversational, which only made it more terrifying. "You deliberately tripped a woman who is working to serve you. You caused a disturbance at my table." It was an accident," Sienna lied, her voice shrill with genuine terror. "My men," Gabriel said slowly, "do not tolerate accidents near me. If one of them had reacted to your sudden movement, you would currently be bleeding out on this expensive rug." He let the horrific image hang in the dead air of the ballroom. "Apologize to her." Sienna blinked, tears of humiliation welling in her eyes. "What?" "Apologize to the woman on my lap," Gabriel commanded, his grip on Clara's thigh flexing possessively. "Now, or you will never walk into a building in this city again without my permission." The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Clara Hughes sat perfectly still on Gabriel Costa's lap, the solid wall of his chest rising and falling rhythmically against her back. She was hyper-aware of everything: the shattered baccarat crystal on the mahogany table, the spilled amber liquid dripping onto the imported Persian rug, and the crushing, unyielding grip of Gabriel's hand on her thigh. Most of all, she was aware of the eyes. Hundreds of New York's elite, people who had spent the entire evening looking right through her, were now staring at her with a mixture of horror, fascination, and profound confusion. Sienna Lockwood stood frozen, the color completely drained from her surgically perfected face. Her Christian Louboutin heels, the weapon she had used to trip Clara, now looked a bird and fragile as she trembled. "I said apologize," Gabriel repeated. His voice was a low, melodic purr that somehow carried over the dead air of the ballroom. He casually adjusted his grip on Clara, pulling her a fraction of an inch closer, entirely unbothered by her sins or her weight. To him, she clearly wasn't a burden. She was a possession he was aggressively defending. Sienna swallowed hard, her throat visibly bobbing. "I'm sorry." The words were a pathetic, choked whisper. Gabriel's eyes narrowed, the coldness in them sharpening into something lethal. He tilted his head slightly, the diamonds on his Patek Philippe watch catching the chandelier light as his wrist flexed. "I don't think she heard you, Sienna. And honestly, neither did I. You spoke loudly enough when you were degrading her body a moment ago. Find that volume again." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Clara felt a sudden, sharp sting of tears behind her eyes. No one had ever defended her like this. In the high-stakes world of luxury events, the client was always right, and the staff was always expendable. Her fatness was usually treated as a liability, an open invitation for microaggressions from women like Sienna. To have the most terrifying man in the city publicly acknowledge the cruelty and demand retribution on her behalf was dizzying. Before Sienna could speak, a panicked voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Costa! Sir, please!" Richard Lockwood, a billionaire hedge fund manager and Sienna's father, practically shoved his way through the crowd. He was sweating profusely, his expensive tuxedo straining against his panic. He stopped at the edge of the velvet rope, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Gabriel, please. She's had too much champagne. She's a child. It was a foolish mistake." Gabriel didn't look at Richard. His gaze remained fixed on the trembling heiress. "She is 24 years old, Richard. Old enough to sit on the board of your shell corporation in the Caymans, and certainly old enough to know how to walk without deliberately injuring the staff." Gabriel finally shifted his eyes to the older man, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "You owe my syndicate $4.2 million, Richard, a debt I have been patiently ignoring. Do not test my patience tonight." Richard Lockwood blanched, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. The public exposure of his financial ruin to the surrounding socialites was an instant, brutal execution of his reputation. He turned to his daughter, his eyes wild. "Apologize to the woman right now, Sienna. Loudly." Sienna burst into humiliated tears. She looked at Clara, her previous arrogance entirely shattered. "I am so sorry. I tripped you on purpose. It was cruel and petty, and I am so sorry." Gabriel stared at her for a long, agonizing moment before giving a microscopic nod. "Get out of my sight. Both of you." Richard grabbed his weeping daughter by the arm and practically dragged her toward the exit. The crowd parted for them, their whispers now a frantic, buzzing swarm. Clara took a shaky breath, her hands pressing against the leather of the booth as she finally tried to push herself up. "Mr. Costa," she whispered frantically, "I need to get up." I'm crushing you." Gabriel's hand didn't move from her waist. He looked up at her, his expression softening just a fraction, though the intensity in his dark eyes remained. "You aren't crushing me, Kara. Stop moving. You twisted your ankle." "It's fine. I can walk." "Clara!" The sharp, shrill voice of David Harrison, the regional director of Premier Luxe Events, echoed through the alcove. He was practically sprinting toward them, his face purple with rage and panic. He stopped at the velvet rope, bowing his head subserviently to Gabriel, before shooting Clara a look of absolute venom. "Mr. Costa, I am so profoundly sorry for this incompetence," David sputtered, dabbing his sweating forehead with a silk handkerchief. "This is completely unacceptable. Clara, get off Mr. Costa this instant. You are making a spectacle of yourself. You're fired. Clear out your locker immediately." Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. Fired. The word rang in her ears. She needed this job. She had rent, student loans, and her mother's medical bills. The sheer injustice of it, being assaulted by a guest and then fired for it, was a bitter, suffocating pill. She stopped fighting Gabriel's hold, her shoulders slumping as defeat washed over her. Gabriel's jaw clenched. The muscles in his thighs tightened beneath Clara, and she felt the raw, coiled violence radiating from him. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply looked at David Harrison with the casual disinterest of a man deciding whether or not to step on a cockroach. "Did I ask for your intervention, David?" Gabriel asked quietly. David froze, his subservient smile faltering. "No, Mr. Costa. But she ruined your table. She was assaulted by a guest at an event you are paid to secure," Gabriel interrupted, his tone laced with razor-sharp ice. "And my suit is ruined because your staff is unprotected." Gabriel slowly shifted, signaling his bodyguards. The four massive men immediately stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall around the booth. "She doesn't work for you anymore," Gabriel stated, his voice ringing with finality. "Because if she did, I would have to burn your entire agency to the ground for failing to ensure her safety. Consider her employment terminated by mutual agreement. Now walk away, David, before I have my men demonstrate exactly how unhappy I am with your management." David Harrison practically tripped over his own feet as he scrambled backward, nodding frantically before disappearing into the crowd. Gabriel finally released his crushing grip on Clara's waist, shifting his hands to her hips to help her stand. "Let's go," he murmured. Clara tried to put weight on her left foot, but a searing, white-hot pain shot up her calf. She gasped, her knee buckling instantly. She braced herself for the inevitable fall, but Gabriel was already there. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for permission. Gabriel stepped into her space, slid one massive arm under her knees, and wrapped the other firmly around her back. With a smooth, effortless exertion of power, he lifted her entirely off the ground. Clara gasped, instinctively throwing her arms around his thick neck to steady herself. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a size 20. She was solidly built, heavy, and undeniably large. Men did not sweep her off her feet. The simple physics of it usually prevented such romanticized gestures. Yet Gabriel carried her against his chest as if she weighed absolutely nothing. The ease with which he held her was terrifying, a raw display of physical strength that completely bypassed her deep-seated insecurities. "Mr. Costa, put me down!" she hissed, her face burning hot with embarrassment as the entire ballroom stared at them. "I'm too heavy. You're going to hurt yourself." Gabriel looked down at her, a dark, genuine amusement flickering in his cold eyes for the first time all night. "I bench press 300 pounds for a warm-up, Clara. Stop insulting my gym routine." He turned and walked toward the exit, his bodyguards forming a perfect diamond formation around them, carving a path through the sea of stunned socialites. Nobody breathed a word. The elite of New York parted like the Red Sea, their eyes wide as the city's most dangerous man carried the plus-size event coordinator out of the grand ballroom. The night air hit Clara like a physical blow as they exited the Plaza Hotel. The cold November wind whipped around them, but the heat radiating from Gabriel's solid body kept her inexplicably warm. A sleek, armored black Rolls-Royce Phantom was already idling at the curb. One of the bodyguards opened the heavy door, and Gabriel carefully deposited Clara into the expansive, plush leather interior before sliding in beside her. The door shut with a heavy, vacuum-sealed thud, cutting off the noise of the city. Clara immediately scrambled to press herself against the opposite door, putting as much space between them as the spacious back seat allowed. She reached down, gently massaging her swelling ankle, her mind racing. "Why did you do that?" she demanded, the shock finally wearing off, leaving behind a sharp spike of adrenaline. "You just cost me my career. You humiliated a billionaire, threatened my boss, and kidnapped me. What do you want from me?" Gabriel poured 2 glasses of sparkling water from the car's built-in console, offering one to her. When she refused to take it, he set it down and unbuttoned his ruined suit jacket. "I didn't kidnap you, Clara. I removed you from a burning building." "The plaza isn't on fire," she snapped. "Not literally," Gabriel replied, his voice calm, leaning back into the leather. "In exactly 12 minutes, the FBI is going to raid that gala. They are going to lock the doors, confiscate every piece of electronics, and arrest the senior management of Premier Lux Events." Clara stared at him, the air leaving her lungs. "What? Why?" "Because your boss, David Harrison, has been using the company to launder money for the Falcone family for the last 3 years, Gabriel stated matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. The inflated catering invoices, the phantom floral arrangements, the exclusive vendor fees. It was a very sloppy washing operation. The feds finally caught on. Clara's mind reeled. The odd accounting discrepancies, David's sudden, unexplained panic attacks over minor invoices, the cash bonuses he occasionally handed out to keep the staff quiet. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hands shaking. "I'm the senior coordinator. My signature is on half of those vendor approvals. They're going to think I'm involved." "They would have," Gabriel agreed, his dark eyes watching her carefully. "Which is why you needed to leave before midnight. You are no longer an employee. You were publicly fired, violently and dramatically in front of 400 witnesses, including 2 state senators and a dozen CEOs. David Harrison terminated you. You are completely severed from the company, both legally and practically." Clara blinked, processing the magnitude of what he was saying. The spilled drink, the humiliation of Sienna Lockwood, the public firing. It wasn't just a mafia boss flexing his power over a clumsy incident. It was a meticulously orchestrated extraction. "You knew," Clara breathed, staring at him. "You knew the raid was happening. You orchestrated that whole scene to get me fired on record before the FBI locked down the building." Gabriel didn't deny it. He took a slow sip of his water. "Sienna tripping you was an unexpected bonus. It provided the perfect catalyst. But yes, I was going to find a way to get you out." "But why?" Clara asked, her voice cracking slightly. She looked down at her stained blazer, her sensible, scuffed flats, her heavy thighs. I'm just an event planner. I don't know you. We've never spoken. Why would Gabriel Costa, the head of the largest syndicate on the East Coast, care if a nobody like me goes down for wire fraud? Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. The streetlights of Fifth Avenue flashed through the tinted windows, casting shifting shadows over his sharp, ruthlessly handsome face. He reached across the seat, his large hand gently wrapping around her uninjured calf, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. "Because you are not a nobody, Clara," Gabriel said, his voice dropping into a rough, intimate register that made her breath hitch. "I've been watching you run my corporate events for 6 months. You are brilliant. You are ruthless when you need to be. You don't fawn over the wealth, and you don't break under pressure." His thumb stroked the side of her leg, a possessive, grounding touch. "I despise the fake, starving sycophants in that room. I prefer reality. I prefer substance. And starting tomorrow, you are going to work for me." "Work for you," Clara echoed, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She stared at Gabriel Costa, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. The tinted windows of the Rolls-Royce kept the glaring streetlights of Manhattan at bay, but inside the spacious cabin, the atmosphere was suffocatingly dense. "You're out of your mind. I'm an event planner, not a mob associate. I arrange floral centerpieces and manage catering timelines. I don't launder money, and I certainly don't work for organized crime." Gabriel didn't flinch at her accusation. His dark, heavy-lidded eyes remained fixed on her, calculating and perfectly calm. His hand, still resting with possessive weight on her calf, did not move. The warmth radiating from his palm was deeply distracting, grounding her even as her mind spun out of control. "I have enough criminals on my payroll, Clara," Gabriel said smoothly. "I don't need another one. What I need is someone who understands the legitimate world. Someone who can run the crown jewel of my legal empire without crumbling under the pressure of wealthy, entitled parasites." "What crown jewel?" Clara asked, unable to stop her own curiosity, despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "The Beaumont Hotel," Gabriel replied. "I finalized the acquisition this morning. It needs a new director of operations, someone meticulous, someone who can organize high society galas and manage a staff of 400 without missing a single detail. You are the most competent person I have watched in this city. You handled a massive logistical failure at the charity auction 3 months ago in under 20 minutes, and you didn't break a sweat." Clara swallowed hard. He remembered the charity auction. She had spent that entire night running up and down 4 flights of stairs because the service elevators broke, tearing the inner lining of her thighs and sweating through her blouse, completely ignored by everyone. And Gabriel had noticed. "You've been stalking me," she whispered, a mixture of fear and strange, undeniable validation pooling in her stomach. "I vet my investments thoroughly," he corrected her, his thumb making slow, deliberate circles against her skin. "And right now, you are going to let my private physician look at your ankle. Then we are going to discuss your new salary, which will be exactly 10 times whatever David Harrison was paying you." Before Clara could protest, the Rolls-Royce glided into a subterranean, heavily guarded parking garage. The sheer scale of Gabriel's operation became terrifyingly clear as armed men nodded respectfully when the vehicle pulled to a halt. Clara's breath hitched as Gabriel effortlessly lifted her from the car once again, ignoring her protests. He carried her to a private elevator, the doors sliding open to reveal an expansive, breathtaking penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering city, but the interior was strictly minimalist, wrapped in dark stone, leather, and steel. Gabriel placed her gently on a plush, oversized velvet sofa in the center of the living room. "Matteo," Gabriel called out, not raising his voice, but a sharp-suited man immediately stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. "Get Dr. Bennett. Tell him to bring the portable X-ray unit, and turn on the news." Matteo nodded sharply, grabbing a remote control. A massive flat-screen television hummed to life on the far wall. The breaking news chyron flashed in stark, aggressive red letters across the bottom of the screen. FBI raids premiere. Luxe events at the Plaza Hotel. Multiple arrests in high-profile money. Laundering sting, Clara gasped, pressing a hand over her mouth. The screen showed footage of men in FBI windbreakers cordoning off the very ballroom she had been standing in less than 30 minutes ago. She saw David Harrison, her now former boss, being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle in handcuffs, his face pale and terrified. "They locked down the building at exactly midnight," Gabriel murmured, stepping up behind the sofa. He unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling up the sleeves of his dress shirt to reveal forearms covered in intricate dark ink. "If you had been there, your name would be on a federal indictment by sunrise. Your career would be over, and you would be facing 10 years in a minimum security facility." Clara couldn't look away from the screen. Her entire life had almost been incinerated. "The Falcone family," she whispered, remembering the name he had mentioned in the car. "David was laundering for them. If you knew and you tipped off the feds, the Falcones are going to know it was you." "They already know," Gabriel said, an edge of dark anticipation in his tone. "I've been dismantling their territories for 6 months. Taking down their washing operation was just a matter of timing. But that is my business, Clara, not yours. Your business is running the Beaumont. Why do you care about a hotel?" Clara turned to look up at him, her brow furrowed. "You're a Mafia boss." Gabriel walked around the sofa, crouching down slowly so he was at eye level with her. The proximity was intoxicating. He smelled like expensive scotch, gunpowder, and pure, raw masculinity. Because the illegitimate money doesn't last forever. The syndicate needs a clean, impenetrable fortress. The Beaumont is that fortress. And I need a gatekeeper I can trust. Someone who won't be easily intimidated, and someone who isn't distracted by the shallow vanity of this city. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then slowly dragged down her neck, taking in the full, generous curves of her body beneath the tailored, practical blazer. There was no disgust in his eyes. There was no pity. There was only a dark, consuming hunger that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "I don't look like a hotel executive, Gabrielle," Clara said softly, her insecurities bubbling to the surface. "You know how these people operate. The socialites, the billionaires. They want a size 0 former model greeting them at the door. They look right through me. They think I'm part of the catering equipment." Gabriel's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering furiously in his cheek. He reached out, his large, rough hand cupping her jaw. His grip was firm, tilting her face up so she couldn't look away from him. "Let them look through you," Gabriel growled, his voice vibrating with lethal intensity. "Let them underestimate you. They are weak, fragile creatures surviving on Daddy's trust funds and eating disorders. You are real. You have substance. The next time a guest disrespects you in my hotel, you will not step aside, Clara. You will throw them out on the pavement, and I will stand right behind you to ensure they never walk back in." The words hit her like a physical shockwave. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her body, at her size, and seen armor instead of a flaw. "Okay," Clara breathed, the single word sealing her fate. "I'll do it." 4 weeks later, the grand reopening of the Beaumont Hotel was the most coveted ticket in New York City. Clara Hughes stood at the top of the grand marble staircase, overlooking the sprawling, newly renovated lobby, and for the first time in her life, she felt genuinely untouchable. Gabriel had spared no expense, but more importantly, he had spared no expense on her. Clara was wearing a custom-made midnight blue silk gown that draped flawlessly over her curves. It hugged her full waist, accentuated her heavy bust, and flowed down to the floor, concealing the slight limp she still favored when she was tired. Her hair was professionally styled into soft waves, and her makeup was razor-sharp. She wasn't invisible anymore. When she walked through the room, people stopped and stared, not with disdain, but with absolute respect and awe. They knew exactly who she was. Gabriel Costa's right hand, the undisputed queen of the Beaumont. Gabriel had kept his word. He gave her complete control of the legitimate operations, paying her an exorbitant salary, and he never once interfered with her decisions. But he was always there, hovering in the periphery, watching her. Whenever a difficult client tried to raise their voice at her, one of Gabriel's heavily armed guards would simply step out of the shadows, and the client would immediately apologize. It was a terrifying, intoxicating kind of power. "The mayor's table is requesting another round of the vintage Bordeaux, Miss Hughes," a young, eager server whispered, standing respectfully beside her. "Send it over, but add it to his personal tab, not the comp list," Clara ordered smoothly, her eyes scanning the crowd. "He already had his 2 complimentary bottles. We are running a business, not a charity." "Yes, ma'am." The server hurried off. Clara took a deep breath, smoothing the silk over her hips. Everything was perfect, almost too perfect. Gabriel was currently in a private meeting in the mezzanine, dealing with syndicate matters he explicitly kept her out of. She relished the independence, but a small, nagging anxiety tugged at the back of her mind. The Falcone family had been bleeding money and territory ever since the raid on Premier Luxe events. The streets were quiet. Too quiet. Deciding to check the perimeter, Clara walked down the marble corridor toward the VIP private dining rooms. The music from the main lobby faded, replaced by the hushed silence of the plush, soundproofed hallway. Well, if it isn't Costa's new favorite pet, Clara froze. The voice was slick, cruel, and dripping with venom. Stepping out from an alcove was Dominic Falcone, the youngest and most unpredictable son of the rival Mafia family. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wore a dark leather jacket, his eyes wild and bloodshot, and his right hand was shoved deep into his pocket. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs, but she forced her posture to remain perfectly straight. "This is a private event, Mr. Falcone. If you don't have an invitation, I'm going to have to ask security to escort you out." Dominic let out a harsh, barking laugh. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. The stench of stale liquor and cheap cologne washed over her. "Security? Costa's men are busy out front." I slipped in through the loading dock. "Your old boss, David? He's squealing to the feds. My family is losing millions every week, and word on the street is Gabriel Costa did it all to protect a fat, ugly little event planner." Clara's throat tightened, the old insecurities rearing their heads for a fraction of a second before the new armor Gabriel had built around her clamped down. She didn't step back. She held her ground. "I suggest you leave, Dominic, before Gabriel finds you here." "I want him to find me here," Dominic snarled, pulling a suppressed Glock from his jacket pocket and pressing the cold steel barrel directly against Clara's stomach. "I want him to see what happens when he takes what belongs to the Falcones. Let's see how much he really cares about his oversized charity project." Clara's breath completely stopped. The hard metal digging into her silk dress was a brutal reality check. She was going to die in a hallway because she had become a pawn in a mob war. She closed her eyes, bracing for the gunshot. A sudden, sickening crunch echoed through the quiet corridor. Dominic screamed, a horrible, high-pitched sound of pure agony. The gun dropped to the plush carpet with a muffled thud. Clara's eyes flew open. Gabriel Costa was standing there, his face twisted into a mask of absolute, demonic fury. He had grabbed Dominic's wrist and snapped it backward with such violent, effortless force that the bone had pierced the skin. Before Dominic could even process the pain, Gabriel moved. He grabbed the Falcone heir by the throat, slamming him against the silk-paneled wall with enough force to crack the drywall. Gabriel's eyes were entirely black, devoid of anything remotely human. He pulled a heavy, serrated combat knife from a concealed sheath inside his tuxedo jacket, pressing the blade directly against Dominic's jugular. "You brought a weapon into my house," Gabriel whispered, the calmness of his voice far more terrifying than if he had shouted. "You pointed it at my woman." Dominic choked, his eyes wide with stark terror, blood dripping from his shattered wrist onto the carpet. "Costa, wait. It was a message. Just a message." "I am the one who sends messages," Gabriel hissed. He didn't hesitate. With a brutal, practiced motion, Gabriel drove the heavy handle of the knife into Dominic's temple. The man's eyes rolled back, and he slumped unconscious to the floor like a discarded rag doll. Gabriel stood over the body for a fraction of a second, his chest heaving, the violence still radiating off him in waves. Then he dropped the knife, turning to Clara. "Gabriel," she gasped, her entire body shaking violently as the adrenaline crashed. Her knees finally buckled, the sheer terror catching up to her. He caught her before she hit the floor, his massive arms wrapped around her, pulling her tightly against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, his breathing ragged and uneven. "I've got you," he muttered fiercely, his hands roaming frantically over her back, her waist, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" "No," Clara sobbed into his expensive suit, her fingers gripping his lapels desperately. He had the gun, I thought." "I will never let anyone hurt you. Never," Gabriel vowed, his voice raw with a level of emotion Clara had never heard from him. He pulled back slightly, framing her tear-stained face with his large hands. He looked at her not as a boss, not as a protector, but as a man entirely consumed by the woman in his arms. "You aren't just an employee, Clara," Gabriel breathed, his thumb wiping a tear from her cheek. "You have to know that by now. You're everything." And right there, in the blood-stained hallway of the most exclusive hotel in New York, Gabriel leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't genital. It was desperate, bruising, and deeply possessive, a fiery seal marking her as his, and only his, against the rest of the dangerous world. The kiss was a collision of terror and overwhelming relief. Clara leaned into Gabriel, her hands sliding from his lapels to fist in the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck. She tasted adrenaline, expensive scotch, and absolute salvation. For her entire life, her size had made her feel like a target for ridicule, a problem to be solved, or simply something to be ignored. But in Gabriel's arms, anchored against his hard, heavily muscled frame, she felt completely indispensable. He didn't just want her. He was willing to burn down the city to keep her. When Gabriel finally pulled back, his chest was heaving. His dark eyes searched her face, mapping every curve and soft line as if memorizing her for eternity. "Boss?" The low, cautious voice belonged to Matteo, who had materialized at the end of the corridor with two heavily armed syndicate cleaners. Matteo's eyes flicked to the unconscious, bleeding form of Dominic Falcone on the carpet, but his expression remained entirely impassive. Gabriel didn't look away from Clara, though his voice dropped back into its lethal, authoritative cadence. "Take the trash out of my hotel, Matteo. Send Dominic back to his father. Tell Vincent Falcone that if any of his men step within 5 miles of this building, or if anyone breathes a word in Clara's direction ever again, I will personally dismantle his entire bloodline." "Understood," Matteo replied, gesturing for the cleaners to haul the Falcone heir away. Gabriel gently took Clara's hand, lacing his long fingers through hers. "We are going upstairs. You are done working for the night." He didn't wait for a response, leading her to the private elevator that bypassed the lobby and shot straight up to the penthouse. Once the heavy oak doors of his private residence clicked shut, the last remnants of Clara's adrenaline finally faded, leaving her trembling and exhausted. She kicked off her heels, sinking into the plush velvet sofa, staring blankly at the glittering Manhattan skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Gabriel walked over to the mahogany bar, pouring a generous measure of vintage Macallan into a crystal tumbler. He walked back and pressed the glass into her cold hands. "Drink," he commanded softly. Clara took a sip, the amber liquid burning a fiery, grounding path down her throat. She looked up at him. "He said David Harrison is talking to the feds. He said the Falcones are losing millions. This war is escalating, Gabriel. Because of me. The war is escalating because the Falcones are relics of a bygone era, and I am taking their city," Gabriel corrected her, crouching down to her eye level, just as he had on the night they met. "You are not a liability, Clara. You are the only clean, incorruptible thing in my life. And starting tomorrow, you are going to help me finish them." Clara blinked, her heart skipping a beat. "Me? How?" Gabriel reached out, his thumbs gently brushing the sides of her waist, mapping the curve of her hips through the midnight blue silk of her dress. "Vincent Falcone is bleeding cash. His legitimate businesses are failing because you, my brilliant director of operations, have been systematically outbidding his front companies for every major corporate event in New York. You didn't even realize you were doing it. You were just doing your job perfectly." Clara's eyes widened. The aggressive vendor negotiations, the exclusive contracts she had secured for the Beaumont over the last month. She had unknowingly been severing the Falcone family's last legal lifelines. "Vincent requested a parley for tomorrow night," Gabriel continued, his gaze darkening with raw affection. "He wants to negotiate a truce, but he expects to negotiate with a thug. I want him to negotiate with the woman who legally dismantled his empire." The following evening, the private dining room at Le Bernardin was closed to the public. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Vincent Falcone, a grizzled, aging man in a tailored pinstripe suit, sat flanked by his remaining capos. He looked exhausted, the bags under his eyes a testament to the brutal month his syndicate had endured. When the heavy mahogany doors opened, Vincent's eyes narrowed. Gabriel Costa walked in, exuding quiet, absolute power in a black Tom Ford suit. But it wasn't Gabriel who commanded the room's attention. It was Clara. She walked beside Gabriel, not behind him. She wore a stunning, impeccably tailored crimson wrap dress from Bergdorf Goodman that hugged her heavy bust and flared beautifully over her wide hips. She wore her size 20 frame like armor, A heavy, blindingly expensive Cartier Panther necklace rested against her collarbone, a gift from Gabriel that morning. She looked terrifying, beautiful, and completely in control. Vincent scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You brought a civilian to a sit-down, Costa. Have you lost your mind?" Gabriel didn't speak. He simply pulled out a chair for Clara, waiting for her to sit before taking his own seat beside her. Clara opened the leather portfolio she had brought with her, laying a stack of financial documents on the table. She looked directly into Vincent's cold eyes, refusing to flinch. "Mr. Falcone," Clara said, her voice smooth, steady, and projecting across the quiet room. "These are the routing numbers for your 3 primary shell corporations in the Caymans, the ones you were using Premier Lux events to funnel through. As of this morning, those accounts are frozen. We submitted an anonymous tip to the SEC. Vincent blanched, his jaw dropping as he stared at the papers. You little bitch! You have no idea what you're dealing with." Gabriel's hand shot across the table, slamming a combat knife directly into the wood, a fraction of an inch from Vincent's fingers. The room erupted as bodyguards drew their weapons, but Gabriel just stared dead-eyed at the older boss. "Speak to my future wife with respect, Vincent, or the parley ends right now with your throat on the floor." The room fell into a deathly silence. Future wife. Clara's heart soared, a flush of heat rising to her cheeks, but she maintained her iron composure. "The deal is simple, Vincent," Clara continued, ignoring the weapons drawn around them. "You surrender your remaining port territories in Brooklyn to the Costa Syndicate. In exchange, I do not hand over the decrypted ledgers to the FBI, which would ensure you and your sons die in federal prison. You retire. You leave New York. Or you lose everything." Vincent stared at the large, beautiful woman sitting across from him. He saw the cold business acumen in her eyes, backed by the lethal, uncompromising force of Gabriel Costa. He realized with crushing certainty that he had been outplayed, not by bullets, but by brilliance. Vincent slowly lowered his head in defeat. "Fine. We're out." An hour later, back in the safety of their penthouse, Gabriel cornered Clara against the heavy mahogany door the second it clicked shut. He kissed her with a fierce, burning hunger, his hands roaming over her lush curves, worshipping the body the rest of the world had taught her to hate. "You were magnificent," he growled against her lips, lifting her effortlessly against the door. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck, a confident, wicked smile playing on her lips. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was the queen of the Costa Empire, and she was exactly where she belonged. Clara's journey from being an invisible, mistreated employee to the undisputed queen of a Mafia empire proves that true power doesn't come from fitting into society's shallow molds. It comes from embracing your own substance, strength, and brilliance. She stopped apologizing for taking up space and, in return, claimed the world. If you loved this intense, twist-filled Mafia romance drama, hit that like button, share it with your friends who love a fierce, confident heroine, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, pulse-pounding stories.